For the week is 11.10 and the high 11.60. And the latest on the gold front is $448.50 to $449, and the dollar German mark rate 1 mark 82,65,72. Alister.
Yes, Jerry, I think that probably the lack of any movement in the gold price is disappointing many people, but it has been said over the last couple of weeks on the program that the gold price is likely to be constrained at the top end at that 460 level. It's a very significant resistance level to go through. On the downside, I think probably there are some buyers around, probably amongst the central banks, at the cheaper end of the 430, 435 level. I think also that the platinum market is quite interesting over the last couple of weeks. Probably the most important impact on this market has been the Northern European summer, and it's now into the big holiday season as far as the Europeans are concerned, and it is a time of traditional weakness in the metal prices.
Is that because the jewelers also taking...
The jewelers, the manufacturers, and even the dentists, I think, go on holiday at this stage. And so that there's unlikely to be any big physical demand coming through in the short term.
The basic bottom line then is still watch the dollar then for any pressure or movement in the gold price. And
probably, and that looks as if it's in a fairly constrained range for the short term anyway.
Because of central bank intervention.
There seems to be a lot of stability in the dollar recently in the markets, and that's holding gold in that fairly narrow band.
Barend, kan ons kyk na die rentekoerse? Is daar enige tekens wat 'n mens kan inlees in die feit dat twee van die bouverenigings nou hulle rentekoerse of verbandkoerse laat styg het met 0,5%?
Nee, ek dink daar is tekens wat gelees kan word, veral as ons nog ook kyk dat die senior burgeropligasies is ingestel vroeër hierdie maand. Banke het hulle koerse ook verhoog, hulle spaar- en depositokoerse met tot 1,5 persentasiepunte. En nou ook hierdie verbandkoerse wat verhoog het. So daar is definitief iets te lees daarin. As mense in elk geval kyk 'n bietjie na wat werklik op die geldmarkte gebeur het, dan lyk dinge so klein bietjie anders as ons net kyk na die afgelope maand, waar daar 'n geweldige likwiditeit in die mark gewees het. 'n Totale oorskot van geld. En as ons kyk na die BA 3 maande BA koers, was daar 'n konstante daling gewees op 'n weekbasis tot nou voor die maandeinde, waar koers natuurlik weer so 'n bietjie verstewig het. Dit het bespiegelinge natuurlijk laat ook ontstaan vir 'n moontlike verlaging van die bankkoers, wat ek dink nie dit sal realiseer in die volgende paar weke nie, want ek dink die van Reservebank se kant af sal eers wil kyk hoe likwid die mark gaan wees hier in die volgende paar weke. Tradisioneel is dit baie meer likwid is van die ander maande, maar dit sal interessant wees om te sien hoe die mark gaan reageer ten opsigte van hierdie verhoging in die verbandkoerse.
Gillian, last week we thought the stock market was going to, well, actually take a dip, and in fact it did exactly the opposite, although many of the other predictions were spot on. Is this an indication that perhaps feelings that the market is getting overheated are perhaps exaggerated?
I would say so, Jerry. The fact that the market has a lot of underlying strength to it. We've seen more of a sideways correction rather than a downwards correction, and I think that really shows support for the market, particularly on the industrial side. On the mining side, on the gold side, we heard from Alister that gold is trading in a fairly narrow band. And for that reason, I think the gold share prices are going to drift in the shorter term. But that's a very good buying opportunity for those shares, for the better quality gold stocks.
There has been the statement that has been made is watch interest rates. You don't see any movement there that could affect the market?
I think that interest rates are going to, at the longer end, drift upwards, edge upwards slightly. I don't think it's going to be a very dramatic move, so I don't think that it's going to have a negative impact on the market at all.
The impact is more likely to come if you were to anticipate a fairly rapid or measurable rise in the short-term rates. Certainly on the industrial market, I think it would have an impact, but I don't think either of us would see short-term rates bouncing up in the very short term.
No.
Just to come back to the interest rate very quickly, we did discuss it earlier, but there seems to be some anomaly in the fact that the building societies actually have, to a certain extent, problems in moving the money because there isn't all that demand for housing. And yet bond rates seem to be moving upwards. Isn't that a contradiction in terms?
Well, I think one of the important features here is that at least one major banking organisation has held their rate at 12.5 and said they'll hold it that way right through till next year. And I think that creates, and I'm not surprised then, that building societies are not getting their money out into the marketplace because there is a big player who's fairly aggressive, prepared to lend at a cheaper rate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, panel. And we'll be back in a few moments with replies to 3 of your letters. Gillian, a letter from Durban. Do you think it is advisable to surrender on 11% 2009 stock? At present, I get 18% on the original outlay. I do not understand the offer. What happens if I don't accept?
Jerry, I think if I can explain the offer a little bit first. Eskom is attempting to enhance the marketability of its loans. And in order to do this, it's consolidating 6 existing loans into one loan stock unit, which is the 11% 2008 loan. This will have a total nominal amount of 13.5 billion rand, and that obviously is going to enhance its tradability. When the stockholder comes to sell it, he or she will receive a higher price for it. So it's very much in his interests to do so. Our particular viewer has an 11% 2009 stock. He will receive exactly the same income with the new stock. So I would strongly advise to surrender his and to take up the new.
Barend, meneer Snyman van Northcliffe skryf, ek is 34 jaar oud en besit 2 huise waarop daar geen balans is nie. Ek het ook 'n bedrag van R80.000 in 'n normale spesiale spaarrekening en geen ander skuld soos meubels, motors ensovoorts nie. Graag wil ek weet wat sou u voorstel wat die beste sou wees om daardie R80.000 te belê. Ek het gedink aan nog 'n huis koop. Ek het gedink aan die helfte van die bedrag vir langtermyn en die ander helfte vir korttermynbelegging. Ek het ook geen kennis van die aandelemark nie en wonder of u dit sal goed dink dat ek daarin ook belê en nog versigtig kan wees.
Goed, kom ons kyk so 'n bietjie eerstens na die vraag ten opsigte van moet hy nog vaste eiendom koop. Hy het reeds 2 huise en dit mag moontlik nou die geskikte tyd wees om weer eiendom te koop. As ons kyk na die verslapping in die eiendomsmark die afgelope paar jaar, die klein groei wat gekry is op eiendom, dan mag dit moontlik wees dat dit nou die regte tyd is om te koop, aangesien daar 'n gevoel is dat daar 'n opswaai is in die eiendomsmark. Maar as ons 'n bietjie daarvan afstap en aanvaar dat hy het reeds 2 huise wat hy gebruik as belegging en kyk wat is die ander alternatiewe wat in die mark beskikbaar is met die 80.000. Nou ek neem aan ag daar dat hy tamelik konservatief is, soos wat dit blyk uit sy brief uit en dat hy ook die gedagte uitgespreek het om 'n verdeling te maak tussen helfte op die korttermyn en helfte op die langtermyn. Nou vir eerstens sal ek sê so plus minus R20.000 sal ek plaas op 'n korttermyn, sodat hy likwid kan wees as hy hand op die geld kan plaas by 'n bank of 'n bouvereniging. Presies watter tipe belegging hy daar moet plaas hang af natuurlik van sy eie grenskoers wat hy belasting betaal. Dis moet natuurlik onthou hy kan so R1.000 belastingvry natuurlik kry wat rente betref. Dan sal ek gaan so R35.000 na R40.000 meer op 'n kapitaalgroei-belegging op die mediumtermyn. En hier kan ons natuurlik nou dink omdat hy ook praat daarvan aandele, miskien 'n aandeleportefeulje vir hom uitwerk, meer kapitaalgroei, standhoudende aandele met 'n goeie rekord in die verlede. Kan ons daarna kyk, maar as hy voel dit is ook 'n bietjie meer riskant vir hom, dan kan hy natuurlik oor beweeg na effekte trust toe en selfs daai belegging so 'n bietjie opdeel na 2 na 3 effekte trust toe. As hy voel die mark is miskien 'n bietjie aan die hoë kant, dan kan hy selfs dit oorweeg om daardie R35.000 te gebruik om 'n jaargeld aan te koop, sê vir 'n 4 of 'n 5 jaar termyn en dan sistematies in die mark in te kom deur daardie jaargeldpaaiement oor te dra na die effekte trust toe. En dan sal ek kyk na die langtermyn, so R20.000-25.000 op 'n langtermynbelegging plaas. En hier sal ek die versekeringsmaatskappye baie sterk aanbeveel in een van hulle beleggingsplanne. Relatief lang tydperk, 10 jaar termyn, maar die volle kapitaal is gewaarborg. Die prestasie of die opbrengs wat hy kry hang natuurlik af van die prestasie van die versekeringsmaatskappy. Maar as ons kyk 'n bietjie na die goeie groei wat daar gekry is op die tipe beleggings, dan sien ons dat oor die laaste 10-15 jaar is die inflasiekoers altyd by verre geklop. So ek dink is 'n baie goeie tipe belegging wat hy daar kan maak. So om op te som, dink ek 'n goeie verspreiding tussen die kort, medium en langtermyn met die nodige balans tussen likwiditeit, veiligheid aan die een kant en risiko aan die ander kant.
Dankie. Just very quickly on the property market, Barend has mentioned too that possibly the market will turn up. Residential property, very briefly, Gillian, do you think that that market has perhaps finally bottomed and due for an upturn?
I would say that we have seen the bottom in the residential property market, yes, and it is starting to move upwards. But it's a slow-moving sector.
Alister?
No, I just think that the property market is one of these where we're probably going to go through the next cycle where people trade up in terms of their homes. You know, people like to move from one district to another district, and perhaps they're in a position at the present time to take on some more debt.
Alice, then a question for you, staying with you. Mr. Menry of Benoni writes, I am 63 years old, living on a pension supplemented by dividends from savings invested in unit trusts. Over the past 5 years, the return was about 25%, of which only 5% was taxable. Even allowing for the initial charge, 7%, my return effectively exceeded 20%. In contrast, after tax at a rate of 33%, the 15% granny bond only yields 10%. Now, unit trusts also impose no restriction should I require to withdraw from capital. Could you comment? Basically, bottom line is comparison with the granny bonds, unit trust versus granny bonds.
What a question.
Ask that from a trust manager.
No, I think that if you take a man who's 63 years of age at the present time, he is retired, he's probably got a life expectancy, actuarially, he doesn't say in what kind of health he is, but he's probably got another 12 to 20 years to live. And I think that when we are going through a period right now of 15, 17% inflation, and likely to live through that for quite some time to come, that he must be looking to a rising income stream and certainly to try and protect his capital because he has a non-working life ahead of him which he must satisfy in terms of income. On the other hand, I think that it would be fair to say that any instrument in the financial sphere which distorts a pattern of rates, and certainly the granny bond, you called it something else, granny bond, distorts the whole interest rate pattern at the short end of the market. And I think for those who are privileged to go into it, I don't qualify yet, but I think that those who are privileged to go into that one probably have a pretty good return, and certainly it's a secure one. And I wouldn't like anybody to think that unit trusts are going to inevitably produce 25% compound growth in value every year. On the other hand, I think that clearly in an inflationary environment, they will continue to show very sound growth.
There is one question related to that now at this point in time, with the unit trust growth pattern having possibly peaked over the last few years. Is it not now opportune for somebody who has invested over a number of years to sell his unit trust and go to a stockbroker and invest it in some kind of managed portfolio, say whatever the amount is, 20,000 plus? Alister, you're not going to agree, I believe, but...
Well, I think we have a stockbroker here this evening. Some stockbrokers do provide a service where they will manage portfolios. All I can say is that good advice doesn't come cheaply.
One of the things, it depends on how much the investor wants to put in. And you can't get, with under 10,000, you can't get a very good spread of investments with a single portfolio in the way that you can with the unit trust. But in excess of that, you probably could.
But aren't the brokers possibly better able to move very quickly to market changes compared with trust managers?
Some of them are old, some of them are young, Jerry. We all move fast as well.
Thank you very much. Binne enkele oomblikke gesels ons met Colin Wood, bestuurende direkteur van die L.T.A konstruksiemaatskappy. Maar eers, hier is ons adres vir die briewe.
Send your investment questions to Diagonal Street, PO Box 8606, Johannesburg, 2000. Stuur u beleggingsvrae aan Diagonalstraat, posbus 8606, Johannesburg, 2000.
The building industry is certainly a good barometer of the economy, and within the industry itself, or within the construction industry, fewer groups are a better indicator of the giant L.T.A group. It has just had a fairly good financial year, showing a turnaround of some 50 million rand into profitability of 4.5 million. And with us tonight is Colin Wood, Managing Director of the group. Colin, could we possibly look at your figures, and do you say they represent a fundamental shift in the building industry in totality, or is it specifically your positioning in the market?
Jerry, I don't think that they represent a shift in the country as a whole. What has happened is that we have managed to maintain our profitability in South Africa. much along the lines of what we did last year. But what we have managed to eliminate is the huge losses we made offshore last year. I could not possibly say that, in fact, the industry is any better this year than it was last year. In fact, it's probably in a worse situation.
Colin, much has been made of the new Mossel Bay gas project and the Lesotho Highlands water scheme. But looking at the time over which these particular projects are going to take place, it's a very extended period. Is it going to have a material impact in any given financial year, for example, in the major construction companies?
Alister, I think you're quite right. It won't have a major effect in any particular year. If one takes those individual contracts, to start with Mossel Bay's planning will start over the next 12 months. And while the infrastructure will start almost immediately, perhaps to the middle of next year, the major plant will really only be built in 89, 90, 91. And presumably that work will be spread amongst a number of contractors. We're talking perhaps about 500 million spread over 3 years amongst a number of contractors in a total market of 5 billion. So perhaps that is not all that significant. The Lesotho Highlands project will take place even later. The main works, which are the tunnel and the dam, will really only be built in the early 90s, between 90 and 95. And once again, that'll be spread over 4 to 5 years. That's a lot of work. That's 1.25 billion. But once again, it's quite far off. And the effect on individual contractors perhaps may not be as marked as people estimate. I think the final one, which you didn't mention, of course, are the toll roads.
Yes.
And there are two major groups of roads that could well come out over the next year. All of us will be involved in that. Now, the section that we're involved in will be something of the order of 600 million, spread over 4 to 5 years, divided up between 4 contractors. And what that lands up for any one of us is perhaps the equivalent of 1 major road contract a year.
Yes.
Colin, following what Alister said about Mossel Bay and the Lesotho Highlands project, we've also heard a lot being mentioned about low-cost housing, mass housing projects. To what extent do you think L.T.A. will benefit from those schemes?
We've been involved in low-cost housing for many years now, and we continue tendering for contracts of that nature. We are finding that the type of contracts that come out are dealing with smaller and smaller numbers of units, which are less profitable from our point of view. We would rather build thousands of houses rather than hundreds of houses. And also, with the industry in the condition it is at the present time, the prices are low and the margins very slender. We are finding a far more interesting area of operation to be the area where we do our own development. And right throughout the country, we are doing development right from grassroots upwards, where we are picking the land, doing the basic infrastructure, building test houses, marketing those, finding the bonds, and selling out the townships. It's an area which has proved to be interesting and profitable, and we would continue participating in it. However, I think that anyone who's been involved in township development would realize that it's an expensive business, because one has quite a heavy investment in infrastructure and building up a township of that nature.
Colin, your annual report quotes labour relations as a pertinent factor. L.T.A. is a large workers' corps, from the professional right through to the ordinary worker. How are you experiencing labour relations in your country or in your company at present? How do you see the future the next year?
Well, right throughout our group, individual companies are trying to build relationships with trade unions through recognition agreements, basically. And we have not experienced any severe difficulties from major strikes. In fact, I'm not certain that we're an industry where that is likely at the present time. Don't forget that on individual sites, we're on those sites for fairly short periods. And as we go from site to site, the trade union relationship with the individual members tends to break and reform. At industry level, we're also having difficulty in structuring a sensible relationship with trade unions, both in the civil engineering side and on the building side. We don't really have properly representative bodies negotiating and bargaining and coming to a conclusion which could assist or create a framework for the industry as a whole. I think we've got a long, long way to go, but we are not an industry which so far has been marked by troubled labour relations. insofar as strikes is concerned.
Thank you.
Colin, I'd like just to come back, if I may, to a point you made about the fact that you've got a fairly hefty investment in developing things like townships and certainly a hefty investment in plant. One of the features of construction companies generally is the kind of hunger and burst situation in terms of capital requirement. Now, you've gone some way now to reducing your level of gearing within L.T.A. and then you've taken on some more debt in the form of pref capital. Is there an ideal kind of solution in terms of the kind of gearing, given the business risk within the construction industry, that you would see as being appropriate?
It is a very volatile industry, and it's made more volatile by the fact that the government does a substantial proportion of the work they put out, so the private sector has to carry a far more volatile situation than it might otherwise have done. We used to believe that a gearing of 60-40, 60 equity, 40 loan was appropriate. Having gone through the current recession, I'm not so certain any longer. I think a gearing perhaps closer to 70-30 is more appropriate. The reason we pick those figures is that we work on the basis of 70-30, and that when we really need money, we'd be able to perhaps push that up to 50-50. Then out of our highly profitable times, generate the cash which brings it back to the 730, and so have a rolling cycle of that nature. My experience leads me to believe that 60-40 perhaps is not as conservative as it might be.
There's more notes to end up on, but Colin, thank you very much. And there we end this week's Diagonal Street. Until next week, good night.